a politically elected leader, you know it's your moral obligation to citizens to actually take action on climate change, and he's doing quite a bit, and I think is an important messenger for the transition to resilient cities. The city has a very robust transit system, 24 lines, 468 stations, 5.4 million daily users, about 1,000 kilometers of rail. This picture is just I don't know how many of you saw it, but the city is introducing a new taxi. They partnered with Nissan to come up with a new taxi to replace their old, very fuel inefficient vehicles they were using. They're going to be much more fuel efficient, and in 2017 they're going to transition to EV models for these vehicles. GHG 7.9, 30% target for reductions by 2030. A healthy amount of renewables, and they're doing a lot to grow the renewable portfolio. On the adaptation side, obviously they have quite a bit of parks. They're known for Central Park. They have quite a few others. They're doing pretty well in that space. They are actually doing a lot on adaptation as well. They have projects already underway that are working towards proofing and adapting their infrastructure to the future out of climate change. London, of course, has done a lot for the past few decades. Of course, prior Mayor Ken Livingstone's very active, and he's trying to return to office next year. I assume he's going to be trying to compete with Boris for the job. That's one of the most impressive things London has done. Again, innovative practice, of course, around their congestion zone. And to give you a few pieces of data that are interesting from that, their congestion zone has resulted in a 25% reduction in traffic and a 19% reduction in GHGs associated with transit in the city. Per capita 6.2. They have a corporate goal, 60% reduction by 2025, which of course is way less ambitious than a community-wide goal. And they have some renewable projects underway, including a lot around bioenergy. And of course, they're doing a lot with their Olympic Village area that they're preparing for 2012. On adaptation, of course, again, thinking back to the comments I made about Curitiba, has been doing a lot with River Thames for a couple decades now, addressing the potential flood of River Thames with their barriers. So they have done some stuff for a long time and invested money in that. Obviously, again, like all the rest of the cities, there's plenty of room for improvement. Tokyo, the final city in the ranking, they met the minimum threshold for leadership, but they obviously have room to grow there in terms of facing some of the other global initiatives around resiliency. Then have a very robust transit system. They're obviously, again, one of the lucky cities in this study to have access to rapid train infrastructure already. Fees per capita, 25% again corporate targets for reductions, and 10% renewables. They actually don't have that much renewables, but Tokyo is working on improving their renewable energy. That I found in this space for Tokyo was what's going around introducing their own emission trading scheme, and the target is 1,400 of the largest emitters in the city, 6% reduction by 2014, and they're allowing a flexible way of getting to that reduction. But obviously, in absence of global agreements, multilateral agreements for post-2012, cities are now starting to pick up the slack, and Tokyo introducing their own emission scheme is a really good example of that. They're doing very little, at least from what I could tell. Their action plan really didn't even mention adaptation or anything associated with adaptation. It seems to me that it's not much on their radar, although who knows, maybe they have more works that I don't know about yet. But in fact, I'm gonna show these slides. This is gonna be recorded and it'll be available on my website, boydcohen.com. So I'm going to actually skip through these because I really want to get to Councillor Cadman here. And some organizations, I have a list of links for cities you can go to if you go to my website. Now on over to Councillor Cadman.
Thanks. I mean, I think this is very important that we're beginning to look at cities and rank them because when all's said and done, we know that half of the world's population today lives in cities. By the end of this century, 90% of the world's population is going to live in cities. A lot of that in-migration is going to occur in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America. And those places are going to have to figure out how to make their cities resilient. But if their cities are not resilient, they're not going to be the choice places for future investment. And when you've got such huge population booms in those cities, be a place where people want to invest, want to locate, is going to be a key factor as we go forward. So all of these issues, we have focused on the issue up through and after Copenhagen of how do we reduce our greenhouse gases. We got all 14 of the major federations of municipalities on board to commit to 30% reduction by 2020 and 80% reduction by 2050. When things went to a voluntary scheme in Copenhagen, we said, well, okay, if this is the case, then we need to move the game along. And so when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change met in Bonn after Copenhagen, we had pulled together a conference on resilient cities, saying we need to now look at, if you thought that the cost of mitigation was expensive, we can work with you through cities to show what the cost of adaptation is going to be. And obviously, many cities are simply not going to be able to adapt because they're in coastal areas, and they're going to have to begin to pose the question of whether they should continue to locate where they are. And it obviously poses the other question, which is certain cities, like Bolivia, for example, a lot of these places where they get their waters from melting glaciers, where to find their water sources going forward. So beginning that whole resilience question, we've had our second conference again prior to this preparatory being in Bonn, preparing for the meeting in Durban, South Africa, November, December of this year. And more cities are beginning to understand that the costs of adaptation are really very, very high. So we're working on two tracks. One, we have to obviously look at making cities, which are going to be the places where people live, the major innovative elements in mitigation, but also begin to push the issue now of adaptation. And that obviously deals with the water conservation. It deals with issues of green space and that soft engineering that those green spaces can provide, as opposed to the very heavy cost of building infrastructure. It deals with all of your mobility issues, the walking, cycling, and use of public transit. How do you make them the chief means, and that means capital investments to make that happen. It begins to push the question of the way in which you purchase, putting yourself through a screen to make sure that the product that you're buying as a city, and you're hopefully simulating your producers to produce, are green products and themselves have a light footprint on the environment. So all these issues, I think, are going to become absolutely critical as we move forward. And the cities that are going to be successful in the 21st century are cities that are able to adapt and build in resilience. And quite frankly, there are some cities that are going to be very hard pressed. I was at the United Nations Reduction Conference in Geneva, talking with people there about, well, what can you adapt to? And I asked the Dutch Minister of Public Works, I said, well, we're now seeing Greenland melt. Can you adapt to a Greenland melt? And he laughed. He said, no, you're talking at that point about a 7-meter rise. Nobody who lives on a coastal area is going to be able to adapt to that. And so if we don't get the mitigation piece right, if we don't show the way that local governments can begin to reduce greenhouse gases, in fact, can move towards carbon neutrality, we're going to have to ask some very hard questions about what it means to be a coastal city, what it means to be a city on a river that's going to flood, and can we afford the kinds of public works that are going to be required to keep those cities resilient into the future, and or do we have to begin looking at displacement of some of the cities, and where are we going to find the water sources? So all these questions are going to become more pressing, and obviously the more that we think about these things now and begin to make our cities resilient to the future, the better off we're going to be, and the more advantageous we're going to be as a place to live and do business. So these are the questions that we're going to have to grapple with. I think this ranking of resilient cities is great. What I'm, I guess, disappointed in is that really Curitiba well deserves to be on this list, but there are a number of cities in developing countries, China and India, that need to get on this list, and they need to get there quickly, because those economies are growing so quickly that if we don't bring the so-called countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and Indonesia, if we don't bring them into this mix, they're the places that are going to have the most compelling problem. Many of them have already got very pressing problems now. So I think this is a great way of starting, and I think what we begin to understand, if you look at what these cities are doing and what other cities are doing, all of the answers need to go as a planet are our capacity. Yes, there will be new innovations. Yes, there will be changes as we move forward. But we have many of the tools now, and it's simply a matter of trying to figure out how to adapt and put in place some of those tools to make us more resilient in the future. And ultimately has to do with capital and the priorities that we put on it. And that's good. We just done a study for our Resilient Cities Conference where all of the international financing that we knew about, the World Bank financing, and the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, and a number of our cities were really hoping that this was the kind of resources that was going to make their future better. And we looked at it and said, relative to the amount of private capital going to be invested in our cities in the next little while, this is a drop in the bucket. We're talking over the next 20 years, somewhere in the order of $200 trillion is to be invested totally in urban infrastructure. Don't make the buildings that we build as best they can possibly be. Don't build the adaptation capacities of cities. A lot of this capital investment is going to be put at risk. And we pointed specifically to a World Bank loan to Ho Chi Minh City. They're going to develop an area south of the city. And this is crazy. You are simulating that you know full well that it's going to be inundated by rising seas. Why would you want to use your leverage to put in this kind of capital investment and then have other investors follow you into this area, only to have all of that investment put at risk by the changes that we know are coming within this century? And so all those issues, I think, now have to be grappled with in a very tangible